Hello, this is Martin Gore from Depeche Mode.
Hi, this is Dave Gahan from Depeche Mode, and you are listening to
My Nerd World.
And welcome to Depeche Mode, the podcast. I'm your host, Jon Justice. Thank you so much for checking out another episode as we talk about the greatest band on the face of the planet, subjectively speaking. If it's your first time checking out the show, thank you for joining us. As always, you can email me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or if you're enjoying the show up on YouTube, you can leave a comment there. Before we get started on the show today, I just want to share a personal note, and you may or may not have noticed if I didn't mention this. However, for those of you that have been listening to the show for some time, you know that I'm a talk radio show host professionally. I host a news talk show here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I have for the past 9 years. So as I sit down to record this week's episode, wherein we'll get to your listener emails from last week, we'll talk about the song that made you fall in love with Depeche Mode. I'll share mine at the end of this episode as we do another version of Song a Commentary. This week it will be the song that made me fall in love with Depeche Mode, and I'll tell you what that is here in just a bit. That being said, I wanted to let you know that if you did happen to sense any sort of different tone in my voice today, I just got off the air from what I usually do is a 3-hour show. Today I stayed on for about 4.5 hours because if you've been following any of the news, and I don't know if this story has reached overseas for those of us that are not here in the continental United States, but there was a mass shooting event that took place at a Catholic school just south of Minneapolis, not far from where I work. The news broke as I was wrapping up the show, and I ended up going live for another 2.5 hours or so, going with the live coverage of this just horrific event that had taken place. Multiple casualties involved. Some 20 children were caught in this mass shooting event, with the shooter taking his own life in the end. Not the first time that I've been on the air in my 29-year career covering events like this. They're never easy, however. And when I got home from doing the show late, the gravity of what had transpired kind of hit me. And I wasn't intending on recording the show today. However, I really needed something to sort of take my mind off of it. And for those of us, well, for you listening, you know how Depeche Mode has impacted our lives and been there in various stages, both good and bad. And once again, this podcast serves as an opportunity for me to step away from the news of the day, because once I'm done, I'm going to have to sit down and start prepping for tomorrow's show, which will inevitably be covering in detail this mass shooting event to take place at this Catholic church. So I really wanted to sit down and just talk about Depeche Mode for, 20 to 40 minutes and get my mind off of everything. So I hate to start things off on such a down note, but I wanted you to at least be aware of where my headspace was currently with all of this. So, when I wrap up the show every week and I say, I hope wherever you are, you're happy, you're healthy, and you're safe. I genuinely mean that. And so seeing tragedies like this is a reminder of how fragile life can be. So take a moment, reach out to a friend, hug a loved one or a sibling if you have the opportunity today in light of this horrific tragedy. So with that, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to sort of explain myself just a little bit in terms of what I've been going through. Let's dispense with that and let's talk about Depeche Mode, because that makes me happy. So, still no news. We're creeping up on, a couple of weeks away from the on-sale date for Depeche Mode M, which is debuting in theaters on October 28th. I still have an expectation, as I mentioned last week on the show, and I've mentioned since we found out that the movie would be debuting on 2,500 cinemas across the country, and across more than 60 countries, that I still do absolutely have an expectation that surrounding the on-sale date we'll get something in the form of those tracks that we haven't heard, specifically in the end. So I could be wrong on that. I don't have any inside information, but it seems like that would be a really good way to go and promote the movie by releasing a song that has not been released as of yet. That being said, I received an email last week, and somebody had asked, something along the lines of what made you fall in love with Depeche Mode. And I mean, I think that essentially comes down to the music, right? What song made you fall in love with Depeche Mode? And I have some emails that I'll share with you this week. And this is different for me than, what song introduced you to Depeche Mode. Now, they may be the same songs. That being said, for me personally, while I've told the story many times on the show about how I'd heard Depeche Mode prior to hearing Shake the Disease on K-Rock in Los Angeles, but it was really Shake the Disease that cemented the band in my mind. But that was not the song that made me fall in love with Depeche Mode. That song was Here Is the House. And for the song commentary this week, that's the song I'm going to do. Now, this will be exclusive for the podcast listeners. I cannot put this on YouTube because of the copyright restrictions. So if you're enjoying this on YouTube, I hope that you'll go to the actual podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts so you can hear this week's song commentary. But I've told the story before that after the release of Shake the Disease, that's what really began my fandom for Depeche Mode. That's what sent me to the record store in Monrovia, California, to go looking for the album that had Shake the Disease on it. And it was, my memory could be failing me on this, but my recollection was that I went to go purchase, say, Catching Up With, which had Shake the Disease on it, but I ended up purchasing Black Celebration. And I may have bought them both at the same time, but for whatever reason, the first time I physically went to the record store to get a Depeche Mode release, I ended up walking home with Black Celebration. That album in and of itself cemented me as a fan. Again, having only been used to really the singles that have been released up until then, Black Celebration would have been the newest release at the time. And that may have been sort of the default of why I ended up picking it up. I don't think it had been out very long at the time when I went to go looking for Shake the Disease. And while there were some songs on the album, Black Celebration, the singles mostly, that I was kind of familiar with, it was all still very, very new to me. And it wasn't until Here Is the House that Depeche Mode really started to resonate for me. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when I get to the song commentary portion of this week's episode. But I didn't want to bury the lead. I wanted to at least share with you what song it was for me that made me ultimately fall in love with Depeche Mode, and that was Here Is the House. So with that, let's go ahead and get to your listener feedback from throughout this past week. And just thank you ahead of time to everybody who wrote in, either leaving a comment up on YouTube or texted me, like my friend Jon Justice did, John, or drop me an email, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. So let's go ahead and get to your listener feedback emails this week. So first off, we do hear from Jon Justice, and he writes this: my first album cassette was Some Great Reward. I remember riding my bike, listening to my Sony Walkman to that album front to back. I think I fell in love with Depeche Mode listening to Stories of Old. I bought Black Celebration when it came out in '86, and then bought their entire back catalog and never looked back. So that was according to my friend Jon Justice there. So, you know, and again, I wished, looking back, I wished I had kept track of the order in which I purchased Depeche Mode albums. I mean, I could have never imagined that my fandom would have stretched into my 50s at a time when I was 14 and 15 years old. Hindsight being what it is, I wish that I'd kept track of all those little instances of going out to various record stores in Southern California. Record PX for those that are from the region, or Hyde Park Corner out in Irvine, where I went to go searching for the import singles, going out to Melrose in Los Angeles, and there was one particular record store, and I cannot remember the name of it, that I would go to all the time because they always had the imports. I mean, the thrill of the hunt searching for Depeche Mode is something that new generations of fans will never, ever be able to experience. Let's go to a friend of the show, Chris Culpepper, who writes this, not on the topic, but has another question for the show this week. Why does Violator serve as the centerpiece of the live set? Pull out Blue Dress, Sea of Sin, Happiest Girl if the band feels that 1990 is their peak, and give us hardcore fans a treat. I respected the fact that DM grew up and progressed, and that they dropped the hits of their back catalog. People are people, just can't get enough, something to do, etc. I'll just attribute Violator as their best-selling record and crowd pleaser, but I don't want our beloved DM to become a classic rock / greatest hits band with songs that they have to play live. Would any of us be truly devastated to not hear Personal Jesus or World in My Eyes live again? Thanks, JJ, writes Chris Culpepper. Now listen, I wouldn't personally, having been to 34 Depeche Mode shows, dropping Personal Jesus or World in My Eyes would not be a heartbreak for me, having seen those songs performed so many years and so many shows live. Certainly if you're replacing them with tracks that haven't been played in a long, long time. It really just comes down to the band's preference, right? I mean, Martin Gore has been very vocal in how pleased he was with all of the albums, and I think that he marks Black Celebration as sort of the turning point. Some Great Reward may have been mentioned in there, but I do believe that he says, he feels that from Black Celebration on, he feels like they did their best work. I think there's something to the love of Violator, of why that album, and to a lesser extent the few tracks off of Songs of Faith and Devotion that continue to get played live. But it was their biggest album, was arguably their best album. I know that we as fans, it's subjective which album we like the most, but make no mistake, I mean, when you look at the apex mountain of Depeche Mode, it's right there in that area of Black Celebration, Music for the Masses, Violator, Songs of Faith and Devotion. So, I've never personally had that big of an issue in the way that the band goes and chooses their set list. I've always just taken it as, this is what the band wants to play and how they feel they can best cater to the live audience that's coming to see them. And I always have to remind myself that, not everybody listens to Depeche Mode the way that you and I do. Not everybody listens to a Depeche Mode podcast or listens with such consistency as so many of us fans do. So, I think for us, Chris Culpepper's right. I wish they would do a tour, and I've mentioned this before, like Metallica did, where they did 2 nights, and one night was a bunch of rarities they don't typically play. But that's just not, been anything that the band has gone and taken on. And now with their ages being what they are, I can't imagine that it would be anything that they would be doing in the future if they were to tour again. All right, let's go and hear from Christian Rigamonti, who writes this. The new song commentary feature of the podcast is a very good idea, thank you. The Enjoy the Silence live version from Condemnation limited CD single is also a very good choice, since it was recorded at the Milan 93 concert, the first DM concert I ever attended. Cheers, Christian Rigamonti. Thank you, Christian, for that. Always appreciate it. All right, next up, let's see. We hear from, well, it's Johnny, but he typically goes by Tool 46 and 2. And he writes this. Great podcast today, bro. Thank you. So I'm home from a long stint away from a job in Washington. Chilling, enjoying catching up on your podcast, having beers and blasting DM. I queued up the devotional live version of Enjoy the Silence. I hadn't visited it in quite a while, and man, what a solid show. One of my favorite tracks on Songs of Faith and Devotion is Get Right With Me. Mine, too. I just listened to it today. I dig the scratch they have in it, but I've always wished they would have tried a real turntable scratch, though. The recorded one sounds like a stock scratch right off of a DJ controller. Should have called a couple of Technics 1200s. LOL. Anyway, my food for thought on my lazy butt Thursday writes Johnny again. Usually goes by Tool 46 and 2. So this is a really good. That's a really good point as I tap my screen with my pen. You make a really good point with your specificity on wanting the scratch to sound more legit. You can apply that directly to my commentary relating to how all the fans of Depeche Mode aren't like you and I and would listen to a Depeche Mode podcast or want to see deeper tracks when going to see a live concert. I never would have thought twice about that scratch on Get Right With Me or the other scratches that end up appearing on Songs of Faith and Devotion not being actual turntable scratches, but something more pulled off of, say, like a production library. So thank you for that, Johnny. I appreciate it. And I always love that about Songs of Faith and Devotion. I love the mixing of the album. I had an interesting little moment this week, and it dovetails off of something that I said last week on the show, because I had watched Devotional a couple times, kind of splitting it up and picking tracks over the course of the past few weeks on my weekends. Typically, after everybody goes to bed on a Friday or Saturday night, I stay up late because I have to get up so early during the week, and I go to bed early during the week. And a lot of times, by the time I end up heading into my room/office and I want to put something on the TV, I've probably had a little bit of rum, perhaps enjoyed a gummy. That being said, I usually want to listen to something music-related. So watching Devotional, and I made this comment last week when I was doing the song commentary for Enjoy the Silence. The way that the mixes were done for Devotional, for all the tracks, but specifically for the Violator songs that were so prevalent in the set list, the live mixes on the Devotional tour, they sounded like they could have come from Songs of Faith and Devotion. That being said, having spent some time listening to both of those albums quite a bit over the course of the past few weeks, it was interesting to me, and specifically this morning when I was walking in and I was listening to some tracks off of Violator, how they really weren't that far removed from Songs of Faith and Devotion. There was a rawness and more of an analog vibe on the songs of Faith and Devotion, make no mistake. Violator was a lot cleaner and was more crisp. That being said, like, the elements of the songs on both of those albums are not that far removed. That is to say that Devotional did this live. They took those tracks and sort of Songs of Faith and Devotionized them, made them a little bit meatier, made them a little bit more bluesy and analog, and stripped away a little bit of the cold electronic vibes that you got on Violator. But ultimately, those two albums, they complement each other really well in that they come off very different from one another, but in truth, they're really not that far removed. I would love to see the inverse happen. I'd love to see versions of the tracks off of Songs of Faith and Devotion that are more aligned with Violator. Like, what would Walking in My Shoes have sounded if it were on Violator? I think that would have been really, really interesting. All right, let's go and hear from John. John writes this. Loving the show, thank you. Exciting times waiting for M and additional tracks. Agree, In the End is fantastic. Should have been on the album, but they have a habit of leaving great songs off albums. Spending a lot of time, because I listened to the version that I've shared on a previous podcast of In the End. I listen to it almost every day. And the recording obviously isn't great, but if you listen really intently, there's a lot of layers in that track. I am desperate to get my hands on the official produced version, because I think that song is even better than obviously what we can hear in this handheld recorded mix. But if you listen really closely, there is a lot going on in the production of that song. Just wanted to mention that. Your question, the song that got me into Depeche Mode, I'd Like to Just Can't Get Enough and New Life, but I didn't buy the album at the time. But then Vince left, and See You was released, and whilst it could be considered poppy and sweet, I thought it was dark. The music, the lyrics, the atmosphere of the song. Bought a Broken Frame, got hooked, still am on Sun in the Rainfall, loved Leave in Silence, and generally wore out the album. And that was that. And here we are 45 years later, and my love for this group never fades. You know, I'm with you. I always thought that See You sounded rather dark as well. So I'm with you on that. Then he goes on to say, can I ask you a question? Sure. Let's pretend and hope they work on a new album. Who would you like to see produce it? Ooh. For me, not Alan Wilder. Second choice. But William Orbit. This would be a meeting of the minds. Sith innovators, amazing songwriters, dark, atmospheric, I could go on, joining forces with a musical genius, a synth genius. He's unreal. Look at what he did for Madonna, Ray of Light. He's been through the excesses, the drugs, recovery experiences. He's quite introverted like Martin, a perfect fit if there ever was one. I think it would work and we might just get something that would really blow us away. A producer is so important. It can elevate songs to new levels. That's my wish. Unlikely, but you never know. Okay, your turn. Who would excite you as their next producer? Take care, John in Dublin. So it's hard because I'm unfamiliar with a lot of modern producers of the day. And it's funny because I was thinking, well, I really like the production work on a band that I've mentioned before, and that is The Last Dinner Party, an all-female 5-member piece. Really, really love that band. And they just released a new single. They have a new album coming out. And then it dawned on me, I'm like, well, that's dumb. James Ford produced their first album. And he's already done some producing. So I guess the name that first popped into my head, and again, it's because I'm limited in terms of who the modern producers are, but Butch Vig. You know, Butch Vig of Garbage has still been working with Garbage. Of course, did the remix for In Your Room that the band ended up playing so often live over the album version. While I prefer the album version, I do very much enjoy Butch Vig's remix of it. As a matter of fact, on my Friday and Saturday night late night TV watching, I was on YouTube and I happened to come across the In Your Room video, and they use that mix for the video, and I had forgotten about that. His work with Nirvana was obviously spectacular, and I would love to see what he would do with Depeche Mode, you know, in sort of this particular era. That being said, I would be totally fine with James Ford and with the team of James Ford and Marta Solongny again. I'd even be okay with Marta Solongny taking over and her doing the producing all by herself. I think that would be spectacular as well. But I could go for another album of that producing duo. I love the production work on Memento Mori. By the way, I was unaware of this. I just found out about this in the past week, that Anton Corbijn, when he created the In Your Room video, it has all of the references to previous Anton Corbijn videos by Depeche Mode. So I read just this week, and I'd only read it in one place, so I don't know how entirely true this is. But according to what I read, Anton did that in the In Your Room video because it was the last single off the album that he would be producing a video for, and he was under the impression that Dave Gahan was going to die. So that video for In Your Room was essentially supposed to be like a send-off. So he did like he like added in sort of greatest hits elements using that one model/actress in the video to go and act out scenes from previous videos that he had directed. So I had never heard that before. And again, take it with a grain of salt. I only heard it from one source that I saw online. I'm fairly certain it was a direct quote from Anton Corbijn, but you just never know when you see that stuff. So I just thought that was really interesting. All right, David Theofolt writes this. I love the question for us listeners. It's crazy to me how Depeche Mode is such a time capsule for us diehard fans, and how, when thinking about this question you challenged us with, how it took me down a rabbit hole of emotions of my life, and how it brought back some phenomenal memories for me. With that being said, I think I've mentioned this on your podcast when I first listened to you, that People Are People is the song that got me into music and introduced me to DM. With that being said, I've mentioned this on your podcast. But the very first song that I heard by DM that made me fall in love and knew at that very point that this was my band was Stripped. Just the sound, the music, Dave's voice was so ahead of its time then. And I just couldn't get enough, pun intended. That song is, to this day, still holds up and sounds amazing, and one I go back to often. Side note, September 6th, myself, my daughter, and son will be seeing Oasis at the Rose Bowl. First time back there since the concert in 1988. Wow, that's fantastic. I had no idea Oasis was playing there. So, he wraps up saying, "Thank you for what you do. Thank you, David, for the kind words. You always make my drive home from work every day on Thursday very enjoyable." Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. All right, let's go next to, this comes from Ron. "What a great addition," he writes, "to the regular pod. I appreciate others' analysis of songs I really like, and you happen to choose my top favorite live version of Enjoy the Silence. This version is, in my opinion, the most advanced and intricately produced Enjoy the Silence we've ever had, including every tour thereafter." It's funny, so I went and started wiping out watching other versions of Enjoy the Silence from other tours, and he's absolutely right. I will say this, though. I don't know if this makes me a pervert. I don't think it does. I'm just joking. But my favorite, and maybe this is a topic for another podcast in the future, my favorite visual for Enjoy the Silence was on the Global Spirit Tour. I didn't necessarily care for the triangle video screens, but I thought the contortionists were really interesting. And I love how at the end of the song, they end up unraveling themselves and moving off of the glass of which they were pressed up against. It bums me out in the Live in Berlin video footage that the camera doesn't pan back long enough to see the entirety of the three contortionists uncontorting themselves, if that's a way to go and say it, at the end of the song. But I really loved that visual. So let's get back to Ron's email. "Martin's guitar melody leading out to the song's closure is detailed, much more interesting than the sound-alike strumming of later live versions. Even the bass line is altered from the original track. I suspect it was Alan, but whoever produced the backing track was by far diligent, highly creative, and successfully fought the urge to be lazy and just adopt the last tour's tapes as a phone-it-in gesture. You're absolutely spot on. It just doesn't get any better than that. The song that made me fall in love with Depeche Mode, I can narrow it down to two. The aggro mix for Never Let Me Down Again and My Secret Garden. Now, for the aggro mix of Never Let Me Down Again, it was such a new kind of sound for me when I first heard it. I replayed it probably 4 times before moving on to the rest of the album, the U.S. version of Music for the Masses. It actually took me a few days of listening to realize it was a remix. Up until that point, I'd never experienced what a remix was, and my copy of Music for the Masses was a cassette rip with no sleeve and no track listing either. When I finally heard 101 in the live versions of the tracks, it clicked what the aggro mix was and made me appreciate Never Let Me Down so much more. It wasn't for the first years afterwards that I discovered the split mix and traced the 101 live remix origins. You can imagine how cool it was to hear the live remix during the World Violation Tour, and then the Exciter Tour, the aggro mix persists. For My Secret Garden, a broken frame was given to me by my friend, again with no sleeve or other info. Without knowing DM's catalog, I assumed that, excuse me, A Broken Frame released prior to Music for the Masses and Violator, but not by how long. The sound was so different and melancholic that struck a brand new tone with me, so to speak. Leave in Silence was immediately a great track, but Martin Gore spoke to my rational and pragmatic music sense with its steady 118 beats per minute, maybe 120, highly methodical bass line and progressive repetition in the verses up to the middle C major key switch with Play the Fool, Act So Cruel, and so on, then abruptly returning to C minor and repeating the refrain, drawing down to even more abrupt keyboard mash to close it out. What a fantastic song. To this day, it is still in my top 5 DM tracks and set the tone for what I consider to be quintessential Depeche Mode. Thank you so much for that detailed analysis, Ron. I really, really do appreciate it. Next up, we got Brian writing in from Denmark, who says, thanks for the fantastic podcast. Thank you very much. I fell in love with Depeche Mode back in '82 because of Any Second Now. Me and my friends had a pop quiz where I heard it for the first time. I didn't know the song, but the next Monday I bought Speak and Spell in Street Dance Records in Copenhagen. Now, some 40 years later, I have a nice collection of somewhere between 1,700 and 1,900 vinyl records, signed guitar, and other collected items. I have dedicated a room in our new house to my collection. Excellent. Once again, thanks for your fantastic podcast. Take care and be safe. All the best. Brian from Denmark. Thank you. Again, Brian, I appreciate that. All right. Friend of the show, Steve Lank, writes this. Thanks again for another great podcast. Really enjoyed your voiceover part in the last episode. Enjoy the Silence is definitely my favorite DM track and always makes me smile. Also, like you, when I was listening to that live version, it gave me goosebumps. I was trying to think of a catchy title for the, song voiceover part of your podcast. How about Songs of Faith and Narration? That's not bad. As for the DM song that made me love DM, Get the Balance Right. It just sounded so different to the other music that was around at the time. I love the combination mix of that song, too. Keep up the great work. You're a friend of the show, Steve Lank. Thank you, Steve. And again, you guys are all friends of the show. I appreciate that all you write in. All right, and lastly, Andrew Fallon writes this. Firstly, he says, many thanks for including my comments about the BBC documentary, Basildon, etc. Greatly appreciated. You're very welcome. I appreciate you contributing. I just wanted to add to the conversation about my favorite Depeche Mode album / era. My favorite album has to be Black Celebration. There is something so darkly hypnotic about it, combining obliqueness and beauty that is hard to resist. At times, it's almost like some kind of weird dystopian soundscape, complemented by Dave's brooding voice, yet there are also times when it is hauntingly beautiful, especially on the songs where Martin sings. This is the album that first got me into Depeche Mode in the early 1990s, and not long after this, I was lucky enough to see them on the Devotional Tour. This absolutely blew me away, and part of the appeal was Anton's stage set and amazing visuals. I've seen quite a few bands in my time, including Oasis at Nebworth in '96, but nothing comes close to Depeche Mode on the Devotional Tour. After the singles tour and Exciter, I kind of lost interest. But on the recent Memento Mori tour, I think DM came close to recapturing the magic. Seriously looking forward to seeing Depeche Mode M. I think there's an IMAX cinema in Basildon, but it remains to be seen whether they will do the right thing on the screen and screen the film there. Keep up the good work. Best wishes, Andrew Fallon, Essex, England. So, thank you, Andrew. I appreciate that. Let me wrap on this before I get to the song narration for this week, and that is I ended up spending some time again over the course of the past week listening to the entirety of Memento Mori, and I had a bit of a theory. I'm probably off base on this. However, I was thinking back to the many conversations that we've had on the show, especially pointing out weak tracks and strong tracks on albums, and Depeche Mode has always had this level of consistency, regardless of record, of, 2 or 3 songs that are always just amazing standouts. I think what differentiates what we often refer to as devotees as good albums and bad albums is the quality of the songs outside of those tracks that we all sort of universally enjoy, usually swirling around the singles of every album, right? And while there certainly is a quality difference, I don't doubt that or deny that in the least bit. I do think we listen to albums differently, especially when we were younger. You know, when we were younger, at least for me, there was more of an apologetic attitude that we had, especially towards Depeche Mode. When anything new came out, you were clamoring to listen to every single bit of it. And I know we still do that now, but as adults, we exercise a little bit more discretion. All that is to say that I was thinking back across all of the albums and then going back to, what I consider the Apex Mountain albums. Again, that's Songs of Faith and Devotion, Violator, Music for the Masses, Black Celebration. And while across those tracks, I would certainly say that there are stronger subsequent songs on those albums. Not all of them are that strong. I think our attitudes towards listening to the albums changed. I know that I spent so much time wiping out on those records in that era that, you memorize every single moment, you hear every little bit, and you fall in love with them. And that's what I'm getting at. You fall in love with those albums where you end up accepting their flaws. As time progresses and we continue to get Depeche Mode albums, and granted, the quality changed because of Alan leaving. That being said, I do think that we also changed as we grew up, and we were, again, less inclined to allow ourselves to fall in love in the album with an album. I say all that because I spent more time with Memento Mori than I have with all the other albums after Ultra. And I really have fallen in love with Memento Mori, even though I can arguably say that there are tracks on that album that are weaker than, say, some of the tracks that aren't the singles from Delta Machine or Spirit, just to name those two albums. And I can't help but wonder that if I had approached personally Delta Machine or Spirit in the same way that I approached those albums back when I was a teenager that I fell in love with, again, the quality's better, but if I would have fallen in love and appreciated Delta Machine and Spirit more so. Spirit's a tough one. There are songs on that I just can't get by, but I'm going to do an experiment, and I'm going to spend some time listening to Delta Machine. And just over the course of, maybe I'll do it between now and next week's episode, and just sort of exclusively listen to that album front to back and see if I have a different attitude towards it. I did this once a couple of years back when I traveled to Denver after my buddy Matt was so gracious to take me to that show on the Memento Mori tour. When I got off the plane, I don't remember why I did it, but I put on Spirit. And it really became the soundtrack for that weekend of one of my least favorite Depeche Mode albums. But I remember leaving the airport, having my headphones in, listening to that album, and just loving it in a way that I hadn't before. I was on my bike earlier this week. The weather was just spectacular here in Minnesota over the course of the past week. Really felt like fall temperatures after experiencing some pretty grotesque, muggy heat. And I was listening to Memento Mori, and I just had this nostalgic vibe listening to it that I hadn't had really in a long time. And I was taken back to riding my BMX bike, listening on my Walkman to Music for the Masses, except here I am on a mountain bike as a 53-year-old dude listening to the most recent Depeche Mode album from this band that I love, whose members are now in their 60s. So it was a really, really interesting moment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I don't know if I'm just doing one of my wild devotee tangents and if it makes any sense or not, but I just wanted to share that with you. All right, for you podcast listeners, don't go anywhere. For you YouTube watchers, thank you so much for checking out the show. Before I let you go, if you enjoy reading science fiction or listening to science fiction, I already know you love Depeche Mode. I hope you'll treat yourself, a friend, or a family member to science fiction. I've written a 7-book science fiction space opera adventure series. It's called EMBARK. After Earth faces its end, you'll follow pilots Taft, Catha, and their crew on a journey of survival across the galaxy as they fight for humanity's future. It is a fun, fast-paced, and action-packed science fiction adventure without an agenda. It's got references direct and indirect to Depeche Mode throughout all of the books, but certainly in book 1. These are epic science fiction novels, easy reads filled with romance, a lot of unique action sequences, cool technology. You got, this is not hard. This is not hard sci-fi by any stretch. I take liberties with the science in my books. But if you do love Depeche Mode and you enjoy reading or listening to science fiction, check out EMBARK. I wrote it for adults, but it is completely age appropriate for those 11 and older. Head on over to Amazon.com and pick up your preferred version, whether it's ebook, free on Kindle Unlimited, hardcover, paperback, or audiobook, again, at Amazon.com. So for the YouTube listeners, thank you so much for hanging out. I'll talk to you again next week. If you want to hear the rest of the show, be sure to go find the podcast on whatever podcast platform that you happen to listen to.